Hey there, this is Jim Gavigan with Industrial Insight, and I am privileged to have a very special guest with me today, Mr. Lance Fountain, who I've known for probably, 10 years, I think? I think I met you
And plus, I think, yeah.
yeah, because I think I met you at my very first Pi World in 2013. You were working for Alcoa at the time. So, and I'll let Lance introduce himself here in a minute and kind of what some of the things he's done. But really, we have this idea of kind of a three-part series of kind of where we've been, where we're going, and where we should go, in the future when it comes to smart manufacturing. And today we're going to talk about how we got where we are, and then we're going to kind of set up where we think we need to go, the beginnings of that today into part two. So Lance, why don't you introduce yourself and let everybody know who maybe follows me but doesn't know you. I'm sure people who have been in the Pi and Aviva space probably know you. They should. But there's a lot of people who aren't necessarily in that space who don't know you at all.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. So Lance Fountain, and I have kind of a long storied history in manufacturing, in smart manufacturing. And my background is digital. My background is automation, OT, operations technology.
As
But
is mine.
I've also spent a significant amount of time in IT. So I've really worked on both sides of the fence, and I think that's important as we have this discussion around digital.
100%.
But the other side of that is I've worked in manufacturing, and I've gotten really close to what the challenges are in manufacturing, what does success look like now and in the future. And I think that's maybe part of the story that's missing in some of our conversations. So I've been at this for about 30 years, a little over 30 years. I spent about 20 years of my career with Alcoa Aluminum in a variety of roles, from automation through IT and into smart manufacturing. I spent about 5 years with, as you said before, with OSI Soft / Aviva, where I worked as their principal advisor for digital transformation, working with their largest customers on this journey. And then I spent the last 5 years with Cargill, leading their corporate smart manufacturing efforts. So pleased to be here. I think we have a great story to tell, Jim.
I do too.
And this is really about how we move forward together. It's not about what you do with any integrator, what you do with any technology, what you do individually as a company. But we're in this journey together because this is important. When we think about the future of manufacturing, the future of global stability, global consumption, we know we have to get better at what we do. And that's what this is really all about.
Right. I'm not even really sure we're going to get into any specific technology or platforms. And if we do, it'll be part three. So we're really
Yeah.
going to talk about the lay of the land, some of the things that you and I both see. I think you've seen it from a higher level than I have, but I see it because a lot of times I'm working with plant personnel and I kind of see the remnants of it. I talk to a lot of corporate people as well, and you've been a little more plugged into that space than I have. So some of the things you've told me has been pretty enlightening for me as well, and I think a lot of people would benefit from hearing it. So I think the first thing we really want to talk about is kind of the history and like how we got where we are, and really how manufacturing changed probably early on in our careers. It was really undergoing a lot of change in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and it was not for the better in my mind. And as a matter of fact, I even have a blurb on my website that I didn't care for it. It hurt. It was decimating small town America. All these manufacturing plants were leaving. So why don't you give us a little history lesson on that?
I'm glad you brought that up, Jim. I'm from a very small town in upstate New York, Messina, New York, that area. And it hits home because, I grew up, my father was a millwright at an aluminum facility. And,
Come by that honestly then.
Yeah, that plant started with, thousands of people. I think at one time it was 4,000 or 5,000 people in the plant. By the time I left that facility, they were down in the thousands, right? And, so there was this trend, of jobs being eliminated. And, that was part of this whole discussion. And that's natural. When we think about improving productivity, that's natural.
Sure.
But, what does it mean to the long term, and where do we need to go from here? And I think the real big pivot point was probably in the 80s. And I'm going to start in the 80s. Obviously, a lot of background before the 80s, but the real big pivot point was in the 80s. we were becoming, obviously in North America, we were a consumption-based society, right? You know, everybody wanted to buy something. Everybody wanted to consume. You know, we were fueling things like transportation. You know, everyone's taking a vacation every year, cars, you name it, housing. So we were a consumption society, and we wanted to do that at very low cost, and that's what drove some of the productivity and the you know, how do we adopt automation and things like that. You know, so we became this global supply chain mindset at that point in time, somewhere in the 80s, where we said, hey, we want to fuel consumption. What's the easiest way to fuel consumption? One of the easiest ways to fuel consumption is to get costs down.
Yep.
Right? So there was this focus on productivity and cost. And, you know, productivity hit things like automation. Also, how do we make labor more efficient? But it also focused on things like cost of labor, right? And in the 80s is when we saw this, what I believe to be a pretty significant shift away from onshore labor to offshore labor. Why? Because it was lower cost. And, you know, we wanted to meet the needs of society, but we wanted everybody to be in this consumption mindset. And I think that started, you could argue a little bit earlier, but I think it started in the 80s. And
Probably.
Again, some of this is natural.
That was kind of a boom decade after the debacle of the 70s, where we had super high interest rates, the oil embargo. I mean, I remember as a kid, I was a kid in the 70s, and I remember sitting in a gas line, you know, waiting on gas, you know, just to get a tank full. And I remember, you know, my parents spent, you know, it was double digit interest rates. I mean, the 70s were not good, right? And 80s was kind of the boom, you know, time, you know, Reaganomics and all that. And it completely flipped. But yeah, so I could see that.
I absolutely agree with that, Jim. And like I said, some of this, everyone wants to get better at what they do.
For sure.
Right? Better at manufacturing, improve productivity. That's a natural, you know, that's a natural step forward in continuous improvement. But, you know, the big thing is we as the West, I think, gave away a lot of our manufacturing because of labor costs. We have to call that out. And the reason we have to call it out is it significantly impacted the supply chain. 100%. Now, for sure, the other side of that coin is, for sure, globally now, we have more of a consumption mindset. The Chinas, the South Americas, the Asia, the Eastern Europe, they weren't in the consumer mindset that we were in the West historically. So some of that changed as well, right?
Yep.
But certainly we were very willing to give up a lot of manufacturing in the name of cost and productivity. And we have to recognize that. Now,
100%.
That doesn't mean some of it, you know, wasn't a trend in the right direction to develop other areas of the world, but we probably took that to extremes. And
I think so.
I think we're seeing
I think originally, you know, the thought process was we would take very labor intensive processes that you couldn't automate, you know, garment manufacturing, small toys, you know, things that were just super labor intensive, very repetitive, that the automation just wasn't there. That was originally the stuff we shifted offshore, right? But then it got more and more. And, you know, I think COVID taught us that maybe that wasn't such a smart decision, because as countries, especially one like as big as China and as important as China has been in that supply chain, when it shut down, the whole world felt it. And that was not a good thing. And I think, you know, one of the things that we kind of, you know, talked about a little bit, and I think we'll get more into it later, you know, is there seems to be a demand for reshoring, you know, some jobs. But we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes.
Agreed. So that's kind of the history. I want to add, there's probably controversy around that. There's probably things that we say people agree with, disagree with, but there was certainly a significant change in how we thought about the supply chain and how we thought about continuously improving productivity.
Well,
and it's just important to call that out, because that feeds where we are today.
Regardless if anybody agrees with how we got here, we're here. All right, we can't debate that. You know, we've seen it, we've all felt it. We're all feeling it now, right?
That's right.
And so, you know, how we got there and, you know, the politics involved in all that, I think we ought to fire everyone in Washington, just so, so I'm on the record, from a political standpoint. Fire them all and start over. And they don't care about us anyway. So, but some of the things that, we wanted to discuss here was like some of the headwinds, growing demand, the on-demand, things, local sources, locally produced, some of the other, more political things with sustainability and climate change and human rights, which all that's pretty debatable in my mind, but I don't really want to get into too much of that. But I highlighted on our agenda here, growing demand, on demand, locally sourced, locally produced. So what do you have in mind on that?
So if you think about headwinds, and when we talk headwinds, we're talking headwinds in the current conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to call that out.
Yep.
And I really put headwinds in the three categories, right? Because headwinds drive disruption. And one of those...
This was the shifting customer expectations.
Yep.
So
I'm going to just highlight the three sets of headwinds that I was thinking.
Yep.
One was shifting customer expectations.
Yep.
You're right. Customers expect things today they didn't expect 20 years ago. So that's one set of headwinds.
Yep.
Another one, the shifting global, political, national priorities, right? And I think it's important to call that out. And a lot of challenges exist, and a lot of challenges with instability in that space.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's this headwind related to supply chain pressures, and it probably goes hand in hand with some of the global, political, national priorities, but some of it's a little independent of that as well. So we'll kind of break those headwinds into those three categories and start with the shifting customer expectations.
Yep.
So yeah, what does our customers expect? Well,
Amazon, click a button and it's here in 6 hours, right? Anything I want. That's right. The demand now, right?
And we mentioned it already, but it's important to call out. What happened in the West in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, that's evolving now. We're seeing more of a global consumption mindset.
Right.
You can argue whether that's good or bad, because we probably have taken it to an extreme.
I think we have.
But certainly the demand is growing, and it'll continue to grow. And, we're going to peak at population here sometime in the near future, I believe. I think that's the growing consensus.
Well, I think the birth rates have been coming down for many, many years, right? So, yeah, that's going to happen. And the baby boomers are starting to die off. That was the biggest population. And we're seeing all around the world, birth rates have been declining. And I think I saw recently it was 2.1 births per married family, or per family, was kind of what we needed to keep it about level. And we've been significantly under that. So I think that's the number. Yeah. Somewhere around there.
Yeah. So that whole, again, there's growing consumption mindset. There's a population impact, right? Mm-hmm. And, when do we level out? When does that start to decline? We could probably argue that. But that demand is growing, and it's on demand too. People want it now, right? It's an important thing to remember as well. 100%. You made the point earlier. People click a button, they want it on their doorstep tomorrow. So that's part of the shifting customer expectations. We're also seeing a tendency. People do care about locally sourced, locally produced, probably more so now than they have in the past, right? They also care about things like sustainable supply chains, traceability. They want to know it's safe. They want to know where it's been. They care about human rights, and rightfully so, right? So we have a more active and engaged customer base than we've had in the past. Before it was just, I want what I want. Now people are thinking more about, hey, what are the consequences of what I want? It doesn't mean demand is shrinking, but it's changing.
And I think the internet, has changed that, and there's a lot of, we have the media, but now you have a lot of independent media and social media, right, that are reporting things that maybe the mainstream news had never told us, right? And so that, and that's on both sides, right? There's independent, journalists on both sides, as as we say. I hate to think that we're that divided. I don't think we're as divided as they're trying to make us out to be. But the political left and political right have independent journalists that are reporting on things that are really happening that are not necessarily in the news, and I think people get concerned, over some of those things, right? They see, hey, maybe this company's not so kosher here. They're doing some things that violate human rights, or doing some things that really pollute, and maybe we don't want to do business with them, and we've seen that recently. So
Yeah. Yeah, we have. And I, back to your comment about, you know, you think most people want the same thing. I think inherently they do,
mm-hmm.
right? I
I
think,
believe that.
you know, we get buried in uh, a war of ideas or concepts, and we forget about really what we want. And,
And the
you know,
humanity of it all.
there's always some flow to that, right? There's times when we need to be more one-sided than the other, right? There's always an ebb and flow, and I think we need to
100%.
keep that in mind, right? What makes us the U.S., for those of us in the U.S., is we share this vision of, you know, everyone has an equal opportunity, you know, and how do we win together, and how do you win personally, right? We share that ideology. I don't think that's changed,
Yep.
right? It's just the narrative is getting shaped, and sometimes we got to look beyond the narrative,
100%.
and I think that's
And
exactly what you're saying.
I'll give you a real world example. Like I can look out my window and I see my neighbor. So I'm white and Christian. He's black and Muslim. And I remember he and I went to the beach to go fishing. We spent probably 4 hours together. Even though we disagree on a lot of issues, right? Politically, religiously, we're very good friends. And one of the things that I realize is he wants the same things I do. We just disagree on how to get there, right? But we're past that, right? And I think sometimes we ignore the humanity in it all, right? A lot of us really want the same things, you know, and we forget that. So, yeah.
And it's a growing mindset too. I think we all have
I
to
think
have
so.
a growing mind,
I think so too.
you know,
Yeah.
and we can't think only within our box. We have to be willing to grow. And anyway, not getting too involved in the politics of it all, but a good segue, I think, to the next set of headwinds.
Yep.
The shifting global political and national priorities.
Yeah.
So a lot of these aren't surprises. We have concerns about available natural resources. We can talk about oil and gas as an example, but that's probably not all. It's precious metals. It's, you know,
100%.
it's mining for battery components, solar components, right? It's not unlimited, and we have to learn how to use better than we do today.
I mean, even from a monetary perspective, you know, there's a lot of people are trending toward, and countries are trending toward buying gold and silver, like the rise of the BRICS nations. They're buying gold and silver like crazy. There's a finite amount of that, right?
That's right.
We can't just produce that, you know, we have to go mine it, and there's only so much of it. So we think anyway, you know, so
Yep.
that's, you're right. It's very much
That touches the food supply chain as well when we think about things like
Yeah.
fertilizer, right?
Yeah.
And growth capacity. So, you know, it's not just precious metals and energy. It's also food supply chain coming from most recently from a food company.
Yeah, and you know, we saw when the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, you know, how much grain got sent and fertilizer from that area of the world. You know, Ukraine, I've been listening to some commentary from some people. There's a Colonel McGregor. You know, a lot of people probably think he's a little controversial. I mean, I just think he's a straightforward guy, but he was talking about how fertile the ground is in Ukraine. And he said, man, he said, it's just like black earth. Like you plant anything in it and it grows. And, you know, now all of a sudden you have a war break out there. Now all of a sudden grain's not going out, fertilizer's not going out. You know, they were heavily produced in that area of the world. You know, it starts to change things pretty quick.
It sure does. It sure does. And Ukraine is known as one of the breadbaskets of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, not surprising. So it's disruptive.
Yep.
The other thing you're seeing on the global political national front is, you know, people want critical in-country capacity. You know, they don't want to be able to have somebody shut off the spigot and say, oh, you can't have that anymore, right? They want to be able to produce internally. So that's an important part of the headwinds we're facing there. Obviously, on the consumer side, we'll touch this again, some of these interlap, but product ability to meet demand, right?
Yep.
So people want to maintain that consumption, right? They don't want to have somebody click a button and not get what they want,
Yes.
right? So that's very important. It's important for stability as well.
Yep.
You mentioned it earlier, but I love this one, the demographics, right? And how the demographics of population are changing. And
Yeah.
this is worth a little bit of conversation,
Think
right?
so,
Because
yeah.
we talk about population peaking, and I think we both agree it's probably peaking. But, you know, the truth is the producers in society is shrinking. right? So we've got an aging population. What does that mean? That means we don't have as many people to do the work now as we used to have,
Yeah.
right? Because the demographics don't solve. That's not the same everywhere across the globe, but it's hitting some of your big.
It's hitting here.
Yeah, it's hitting some of your big manufacturing bases, like not only in the
100%.
United States. Take China with the former two-child policy. That had a tremendous
one child policy. Yeah.
Yeah, one child policy. That's correct. Had a tremendous impact, right? So you got to realize, that's impacting, availability of labor and our ability to produce. So that's a shifting priority.
What's interesting is this week I was at TAPICon, the paper conference, and I was talking to, a fellow. I think he's over like 4 recycled paper mills, and we were talking about some of the issues they face just in general, and the big one was labor, skilled labor, being able to find skilled labor. And he said it seemed like after COVID everything changed. And I said, well, why? What happened? Where'd everybody go? Because I hear that consistently. I mean, we live in St. Augustine, Florida, a very touristy area. I mean, hotels, restaurants are struggling to find people. So it's not just, manufacturing, right? We're struggling to find labor. And then I'm hearing, statistics. This is really, I can believe it because I have 2 that fit this demographic, but like 18 to 29-year-olds, there was like, I want to say right around 20% of them are not in the workforce and living at home right now. And, they're not even being counted, and it's very odd. And then, here we are in manufacturing, we have, and what this guy thought, kind of one of the things in his mind is, a lot of the boomers that were at retirement age, COVID hit, everybody had to go, work from home, a lot changed. And they're like, just give me my package. I'm done. I know a couple like that. There were some people that we worked with that they're out of the workforce now. They're done, and they don't sound all that interested in coming back. And so we've seen that quite a bit. So what replaces
I think
that's going to be a big deal.
Now, going back to your COVID comment, I think you hit a key point there. I think it's worth mentioning, and it was coming any way you look at it.
Yeah.
What COVID did is it accelerated it,
yeah.
right? Because
it was like
now,
lighter fluid on the fire is what it was. It was kind of smoldering.
Exactly. People saw their future a bit differently, or they made an adjustment, and it impacted the labor market. And this starts to get into the headwinds around increased supply chain pressures from recent world events, right? So if you think about younger people today, I want to go back to the point you made about, hey, availability of labor and how people think. I talked to a 20-something a few months ago, and by the way, my kids are about the same age as yours. They're in that range you just mentioned. But they don't really want to do dull, dirty, and dangerous.
Yeah.
And, again, this will drive some of our later conversation around automation and where we need to go. But I'm not sure I blame them for that position.
Yeah, they're not going to do
right?
some of the same things you and I did to cut our teeth and learn the ropes, right? They're just not.
Exactly.
I mean, I worked 24 hours many times. I mean, I ruined a bunch of clothes being in nasty, dirty plants, working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, weeks on end, in hot conditions. I mean, I did that. I remember it's now defunct, but I did a project at GenCorp over in Batesville, Arkansas during July. And we did an install and retrofit on a line that was making window and door seals for cars and trucks. It was dirty because, we're around carbon black, we're around this stuff called flock, which is kind of like the felt material you feel in that. I mean, it was just black powder everywhere. And I ruined, I don't know how many sets of clothes at that place. I always wore old clothes and old t-shirts. I had stuff that I just wasn't going to wear anymore. That's what I would wear to GenCorp, and I remember that July effort, there was one day it was 107 out, and there was no air conditioning in that plant. And I think I worked 14 hours that day, and I almost hurt myself. I almost got a heat stroke. I had to start cutting back the next day because I just couldn't go. I don't think our kids are going to do that. You know, I mean, I
Agreed.
treasure that time because I learned so much. But yeah, I don't think our kids, want to do that.
And you can argue whether or not that's right or wrong. I mean, we could sit here and debate that, argue that, but it's a changing mindset.
It is.
You know, uh, technology is supposed to change. It's supposed to change how we all live, right? And as we continue to advance technology, our lives should get better. I mean, that's part of this
But
dream
you
we
still
have,
have to
right?
design it, build it, install it.
Exactly. And we're going to get into that a little more, I think, in later parts of this podcast. But
Yeah, 100%.
the key is this mindset has changed. Now, I think the important part is from a supply chain pressures around recent world events is what are we doing to mitigate those labor risks? We saw it happen with COVID. We see it now. You gave your example about living in St. Augustine. I live in Sarasota. We see something very similar. But, it's there. And what are we doing to mitigate it? I don't think it's going to get better. I don't think it's going to get better. So that's a headwind we face.
For sure.
The other thing we face is the impact of natural disasters. We won't debate all the reasons why, but it seems like we're being more impacted by storms, drought, availability of water, and they're having an impact on our supply chain.
For sure.
And then you mentioned this one before, but I want to call it out. Political instability and war.
Mhm.
Ukraine was a great example of that, right?
Yep.
And yes, that's adding to supply chain pressures. There is no doubt about it.
100%.
It's adding to supply chain pressures. So again, some more really distinct headwinds that we face as a result of what we're seeing in this world around us. So again, customer, the whole global, national, political set of headwinds, and then this recent events.
Yep.
And they're all things that are making manufacturers rethink or reinvent where do we go from here,
100%.
right?
Yep. 100%. Let me take a quick pause.
So what are some? All right.
Yep.
So we'll jump back in.
Yep.
So we kind of covered, Jim, the history of some of the reasons why we ended up where we ended up today.
Yep.
And then we talked about specific headwinds we face today.
Yep.
Now I think we're going to shift gears to what are we really seeing as a result of that? And, this is going to kind of be the prescriptive segment that'll lead into, all right, what do we do about it?
Right.
But, what are we seeing as a result? We're seeing supply shortages and growing concerns around product availability. I mean, whoever thought we'd run out of toilet paper, right? In COVID, we ran out of toilet paper.
Yeah, that was
you're
kind of
seeing,
silly, but yeah.
this may be fueling some of the inflation too, because as you know, supply and demand, as supply goes down, prices go up. I think we saw a lot of that here in Florida around construction, right? Everybody wanted to build something new. What happened? Lumber goes way up, right? So again, there's growing concerns around that.
Yep.
I think we are having pressure and costs related to energy and natural resources. We know we have a limited supply. We know that, right? And we know it's not going to last forever. So obviously there's innovation happening around alternative materials. There's innovation happening around energy generation, but we haven't solved all those problems.
Not at
and that's
all.
increasing.
Yep.
Again, mentioned it already, but inflation, right? A lot of that results in inflation. And there may be other factors impacting inflation, including currency, foreign exchange. But I think we're all seeing this inflationary pressure.
100%. Yep.
We're seeing an increasing desire to onshore. Maybe it's because we're communicating more. Maybe it's because people are more aware. But more and more people want locally sourced. I mean, I think even I am starting to behave more like that. What can I buy locally?
Yeah.
Right?
I'm that way too. I mean, I've gotten to where, I'll look something up on Amazon and then I'll try to find, is there a local source for it, or, buy it directly from, because a lot of times it's a small business like me. All right. And so I'm trying to help them out. And it's interesting that, you bring up the desire to onshore. I think too, part of what drove that was COVID. And I think the shutdowns in China and then they had, what was it, the Evergreen thing that blocked the Suez, was it the Suez Canal? I'm trying to remember, and so we couldn't unload ships, and there was all kinds of headwinds that, made a lot of companies, I think US based, say we can't rely as much on a global supply chain because it can really be interrupted. That's kind of a problem.
The
So,
ports was a great example of that too.
yeah,
You might have mentioned that, but
I did.
the ports, I
Couldn't
mean,
unload
getting
ships.
people to run. They were talking about bringing in the National Guard in some cases to help unload,
Yeah,
right? So again, it's not all just the customer side, which is pressuring us to provide them more traceability, but it's also the reality of it can cause disruption in the supply chain. So
100%.
yeah, tremendous desire to onshore more. And I think that's kind of counter to what we mentioned in the history, which was,
Right.
hey, offshore for cost reasons, offshore for global supply chain, uh, productivity, right? So that's all come almost 180
And I
degrees, I
think
think.
that's as a result a little bit of automation, with robotics and machinery and, the advances in just technology in general and manufacturing. Things that used to be super, super labor intensive now can be automated, where in the 80s they really couldn't be. We didn't have the technology, we didn't have the robotics, we didn't have, those pick and place robots, at all. So there's just a lot of things that you can do with machinery that you used to have to do with people.
But the other side of that too is the availability of people to do it with. I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of like we're this counterbalance, right? Yes, automation will make more things possible, but we don't have nearly the workforce we used to have, or we can even say qualified workforce
Qualified
to some.
workforce, I think, is accurate. I think, well, I mean, the people I've talked to, they're struggling to hire, period. Then they're struggling to find people that are worth keeping. And then they're really, really struggling to find people who are skilled and worth keeping, right? And that's a big change. And that will slow down, I think, some of the onshoring. I'm a big fan of the onshoring movement. I hope it happens. I think I'm gonna have a chat with both of my boys and say, you need to get into something that involves manufacturing. It's coming back. I fully believe that. I think it's really interesting to watch kind of the two tugs going on in the world right now. As you have, I think the elite want to have this globalist kind of a mindset, right? And I think all of us as people are like, no, we want more of a nationalist mindset and a populist mindset, in general,
It's
right?
probably a balancing act there
There, there,
too.
there, there is there is a little bit, right? Because you want to make sure that trade's open with other countries that have things you don't and things of that nature. But I think the balance got really tipped the too much toward this global mindset, and this global supply chain, and I think it hurt. When we have the headwinds that you just talked about, it can hurt. But now you have to now it shifts because you actually have to prepare for that. We
Yeah.
haven't we've had 20, 30 years where we weren't training skilled labor to work in manufacturing. Well, we got to
So
catch up.
let's talk about that labor side, because you've hit on a lot of key points, but I just want to kind of maybe try to bring it together a bit.
Yep.
No doubt we're facing labor shortages. We said that. So now you're talking about more onshoring, bringing manufacturing back. We're bringing it back to an environment where we don't have as much available labor,
Yep.
period.
Yep.
And that's going to have a set of challenges. There's also and you brought this up as well about talking to your kids. I feel the same way, right? It's not only about having labor, right? It's about having labor that's capable, right? And even those capabilities have changed from 30 years ago, right? It
100%.
used to be you walk in and it was brute force labor. Well, now it may be a little more of a thinking job and in an innovation job, a support role, right? The mindset of that labor has changed. It needs to continue to change. So it's not the same job that existed in the 70s. Now it's a different job, and it interacts with others differently. It interacts with management and leadership differently. So
And it's
available labor, and then the types of skills we need.
and it's
And
interesting.
then
Go ahead. I've got a point to make.
one last
Yeah.
point
Yeah.
there. And what's happening now is we do bring more back onshore, or even try to maintain our existing manufacturing. I think this is pretty evident. We're seeing flattening or declining productivity, part of that is probably because we don't have the labor or the right labor, right? Even with the automation, we're suffering in that regard, and we have to call that out. So that's a result we're seeing right now.
Well, actually, your friend John Dyke, when he presented this week at TappyCon, put a graph of productivity, how it's flatlined. And a lot of that coincides with companies investing in manufacturing. They're not investing like they used to, which that could be correlative or it could be causal. I think there's some causal effects of that, right? I don't think manufacturers, I think they've milked it for a long time and they're starting to pay the price. One of the things that you had hit on a little bit, and what I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I actually wrote it down because I didn't want to forget. You and I are both what, Gen X? I know I'm kind of right in the middle.
Yep.
The baby boomer generation was very different than even us, right? We took a lot of hits because we didn't work like the boomers did. When we came into the workforce, these Gen Xers, they're not worth a flip. The boomers just work differently. They would work 25, 30 years at the same company. Many years in a very similar, if not the same job. And that was just kind of the mentality. You went to work every day, brought your lunch pail, and you did your job. And it started to change a little bit with us. I don't think I've had a job until this one more than 6 years. I'm actually in my 7th year now here at Industrial Insight. And, but I change jobs about every 6 years. I'd get itchy. I'm ready to do something different. Because I wanted to continue to learn and keep growing. I didn't want to just sit there and do the same thing. And, and there's something to be said for that. There's a craftsmanship there and an expertise and something that we're going to lose. We are losing it,
There is.
Been losing it. And
there's two sides to that. Oh, go ahead. I'll let you finish.
Then you go to the millennials, right? Well, everybody was, probably 5 years ago was talking about how bad millennials were as a workforce. Everyone on my staff is a millennial. They're awesome. Now, and I was talking to this fellow I mentioned earlier at, over the 4 recycle mills. Millennials want to be a part of something. They want to feel like their work's important. They want to feel like, that they're growing, that they're constantly being challenged. They're even itchier than our generation, with that regard. And they may only stay in a job on average 2, 3, maybe 4 years. They want to move around and learn different things. It's a different mindset. They're certainly not going to be like the boomers, where they're going to stay there 25, 30 years, 35 years, 40. So that's just not going to happen. And then now everybody's on the Gen Z generation. Oh, they don't want to work. They're lazy. They're entitled. I think so for now, but we heard the same thing about us. We heard the same thing about millennials. I think some of that's a maturity issue. 1. 2, we've had it very easy as a society for the last, since you and I've been, probably since the 80s. It's been pretty easy. It hasn't been hard. We haven't gone through any major wars like on our soil or, in the world like World War II or anything like that. So I think there's and I'm going to get this wrong, but it's, bad times create strong men create good times create weak men. And I think that's kind of what's happened a little bit. We've kind of taken some things for granted, and I think times are going to get tougher. And I think, our generation, the millennials, Gen Z, we're all going to have to change based on what's going to happen over the next 5, 10 years. I think it's going to be tough. And I think things are going to get much better. But generationally, drastic difference between the boomers and the Gen Zers. They don't see eye to eye on things at all. It's very different.
No, in fact, the boomers become a bit of a target to some of Gen Z.
Yeah. Hey, boomer.
Yeah. But I'll make a couple of comments on that. Like I said, I think millennials, Gen Z, they're innovative, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the point you made about the difference between boomers and our generation when it came to the workplace. Yes, we do change jobs more. I think we have Gen X. We have a growth mindset, mm-hmm. right? Which is, what next experience can I get? Yep. But there's a manufacturing or employer side of this too, and I want to call that out. I think it's so important. First of all, when I've made my job changes, I feel like it allowed me to take leaps in compensation and
responsibilities.
job reward. I'll say it that way, job reward, even what I did compared to if I would have stayed put. And think about that. So if you've had good employees, what have you done to keep them?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Other side of the coin on the manufacturing side, we're now trying to attract millennials and Gen Z, but we make them come into our plant, and this will tie into technology. Well, write down your inspections on this piece of paper. Right? Here they are in their personal life using their cell phone.
I run my life with this, and you're asking me to write something down on a clipboard? What?
So my point there is manufacturing has some responsibility for this.
100%.
They do. And they can deny that, but they own some of it. And, this is why I have so much passion around this change we're going to talk about. Look, you can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. The world has changed around manufacturing and manufacturers. It's time for them to embrace this and really do something about it. Commit to a different future.
100%.
Right? I think a lot of them want to go back to 30 years ago. Plentiful labor, do what you're told, and we'll keep making more money every year because productivity will keep growing.
And it flatlines.
It's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's what we're here to talk about is, all right, where do we go from here?
Yeah, 100%. And I think what you just said is something I hear over and over. I remember when I hired Ben, he came from a manufacturer that kind of had that mindset. They talked a game, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. He said, I didn't see any action, and even here, right, we kind of got a little slow, got a little stagnant. I guess it was kind of going into the second quarter last year. Things have been a little slow for us, and he was kind of had the come to Jesus meeting with me. He's like, hey, this thing's got to get moving, or I'm going to check out and go find something else to do. Right? You have to keep your workforce engaged, growing, and you can't have this mentality of we're just going to keep doing things the same old way because it's going to fail. It's going to fail miserably.
Well, let's talk about the financials of that too, because I think it's an important call out. Obviously we're a bit older, Jim, and we have probably a bit of a nest egg we're trying to build. But wouldn't you love it if you had a guaranteed 15% rate of return every year?
100%.
Do you get that?
Mm-hmm.
But yet that's the mentality that drives a lot of our companies and specifically manufacturing is every year I'll just get 15%. Is it practical? Is it realistic in the current condition?
Depends, yeah.
This is, again, we can argue this, and I'm sure there are a lot of competing opinions on this. But the thing is, we have to change, right? We're not going to cut our way to long-term success. And we can't keep playing the short game. At some point in time, you got to play the long game. So things have to change. But some of that, how we invest, where we invest, in committing to a different future, that may challenge some of your 15% returns. But it doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do.
So here's a question for you. It's not really on our agenda, but I think it's important. And I think I learned this really when I was working for Rockwell Automation. And I went there right after 9/11. I started there in October of 2001. And it was really slow. Very, very slow for a couple of years after that. Companies just weren't making the same investments. I mean, it finally picked back up, I guess, late 2002 into 2003 and 4, and things got better. But I remember thinking, here we are as Rockwell Automation. We got a bunch of money. We've had good business for years. Now is the time to go squash some of our competitors who can't afford to continue. They can't make the same investments we can make. But they stayed in a very short-term mentality. And I think that was because they were tied to Wall Street. They have to report quarterly earnings, and if we're not doing this and that, then we lose investment because, the Wall Street types, they want their return every quarter. And they want you to know exactly what you're going to do. And it was kind of stunning to me. It's like, I didn't understand why you couldn't say, you know what, financially, we're not going to be as successful over the next 2 or 3 years, but then it's going to take off like a rocket ship because we're going to make some investments now while the economy's down, while we can, and we have the cash to do it, that are going to very much position us to be in a much better spot 2 years from now. Never happened, And then I remember, we got a guidance one year. We had a quarter that was way better than what we had predicted. I had a bunch of big orders come in that we weren't expecting, things of that nature. When we get this guidance, the next day, because our stock had dropped like a rock. I'm like, wait a minute. We just said we did way better than we ever had. And I went and did a little research on that. The reason why was because Wall Street was like, well, you don't know your business well enough that you didn't know this good time was coming. So we're pulling out. You don't know your business. Those kind of things breed short-term mentality and don't breed long-term investment. How does that actually change? How does that fundamentally change? Because that, to me, is part of it. I mean, you got to have money coming into the company to make investment. You want people to invest in your company so you can grow it, but it's a very short-term mindset. How does that change?
Yeah, it needs to be different than it is today. I don't know the exact equation, right, around investment commitment to the long term versus the short term, but it needs to change because I completely agree with you. We will not cut our way to long-term success, and I'm so afraid that so many of our great companies are in that mindset today.
100%. Almost all of them.
And we need to expect more. We need to expect more from ourselves and from them and their leaders, right? It's got to be a long-term game.
Well, and the other thing I was going to say, Simon Sinek talks a lot about this is, in the 80s, I think is where this started, where companies would actually use people to balance the equation for earnings. They would cut people, which they never really did before. So now we're seeing a lot of layoffs because even though, everybody gave Microsoft a hard time. And I commented on a couple of threads because I was like, I agree with you in principle, but this is just the way the world works and we shouldn't be surprised by it. But Microsoft, super cash rich, they've made money for a really long time. They've had a bunch of layoffs this year and a bunch of people on LinkedIn were squawking about it. And I said, that's just the way our world works. I agree with you. Why should that happen? Right? Why can you not figure that out? And one of the things I look at in tying this back to what we're talking about is I look at our industrial plants today and it's firefighting mode because we're so lean everywhere. And this will tie into some of the things we're going to talk about, but some of the labor shortages are self-inflicted. We've run people off by closing facilities, by laying people off because of a short-term mindset, and now we're kind of paying the piper for that because people have gone and found other things to do. They had to still provide for their family. They went and did other things. So what do you?
It's funny you say that because I want to add a comment on that. What happened to the focus on continuous improvement? How well can you do that if you're constantly firefighting,
or if you're constantly cutting? Like, hey, we're gonna, because here's the thing. You think about it. Continuous improvement. We're gonna put a team together on continuous improvement. And then all of a sudden, oh no, we're not getting the financial results. Wall Street's going to be mad at us, and stockholders are going to pull out. We need to cut people. Who are the first people to get cut? The people that aren't attached to real dollars. Oh, continuous improvement. You're not actually in the plants, like pushing product out the door. See ya. I've seen that happen, and it's stunning to me. Stunning.
One of the things I think we can use to convey that message about what it's like on the shop floor, right? Mm-hmm. Is think about this employee market you're trying to target. Let's take a production supervisor. I'm from a small town, so let's say a small town. I want to hire a production supervisor. Think about how we'd have to write that job description. Great opportunity, You know, I don't know where you're living now, but you get to move to this small town. You know what? We're going to let you work 70 hours a week. And you're going to have to deal with the headaches that take place every day on the shop floor because we're in reaction mode, firefighting mode. And when your day's done, then you're going to have to manually enter data and do some manual cleanup because we haven't invested in technology. And we'd like you to take this job. How many people are applying for that job? That is the reality we face today.
Yeah.
And we do nothing about it because we choose to do nothing about it. And again, this is some of what has to change in the longer term thinking because we're not going to be able to fill that position.
No, we're not. And I interviewed a young lady. She's probably, I'm going to guess, early 30s, maybe late 20s. Was working for a major company. I'm not going to name the company or the industry because I don't want to give it away. But she was just looking to get out. She was a production supervisor, essentially. To your point, she said her minimum day at the plant was 12 hours. Minimum. And that was at least 6 days a week. Young lady, you know, hadn't been married that long, has no time for her husband. And when she does, she's too tired. This isn't living. And we were talking about some of this reactiveness and firefighting and all this. And she told me, she said, Jim, I kid you not, one of our major process superintendents, okay, this should be a job for somebody who's probably minimum in their 40s, 45, right? Who's been around for a while and knows this job down pat, was in their mid-20s. She said, look, I like the guy. I have no, you know, he's super smart. But even she recognized there's no way this person should be in this role at this point. And I remember someone at that same company many years ago, probably right after I started, it was my first customer, I was talking to him. And he was a manufacturing excellence manager. And he said, Jim, he said, there used to be roles when I was coming up that you had to have 10 years experience to even apply for it. Now we're putting people in those roles who have 5 years of experience or less. That's how much it's changed. And so I think, you know, all of these things I think are going to play a lot into what we're going to talk about next.
Agreed.
Because we're just seeing the entire demographic is changing. The workforce, the type of people that are coming in are changing. The attitudes of the companies are not changing fast enough. They have a very short-term mentality. And so that's going to actually present challenges to what you and I really preach.
Yeah. And look, and I said it earlier, I want to say it again. Technology is supposed to make lives easier.
It is.
Your story you just told about the young lady working in the manufacturing facility, it doesn't sound like her life was made easier.
No.
It's not just for some people's lives to be easier. It's for everyone's life to be easier. And again, it takes commitment to that. And I think we're still trying to live like it was 1980, our mentality. And leaders, they're responsible for taking that next step, for shifting and changing the game. And that's what we're talking about here. So when you think about, you know, the history, the headwinds, and what we're seeing as a result, now the next question is, where do we go from here? And the concept we want to introduce here, I think, Jim, and I'm going to choose my words carefully. I'm going to say, you know, what do we mean when we say industrial and manufacturing transformation? Right? I'm not going to say digital transformation. Digital is a key enabler.
Sure.
Let's call that out. But this is more about transforming the ways we work than it is technology.
Yep.
And that's why I'm going to call it industrial and manufacturing transformation. And that's how we're going to paint the next part of this story. And Jim, maybe what we ought to do is talk a little bit about what's coming in part two.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we talked about the history, the headwinds, and what we're seeing today. That all leads to this part two.
It sure does.
And maybe we can spend just a couple of minutes in a preview.
Yeah, let's kind of talk about that. So, you know, it's funny, you outlined digital transformation, you know, on your agenda, but really you're right. It's a complete manufacturing transformation, and it's a mental transformation, right? It's not just digital. That's a key enabler. And so, like you highlighted three things, right? Digital supply chain, smart manufacturing, and then maybe even kind of a dreaded term, autonomous plants. So why
Yeah.
don't you talk a little bit about? Let's talk a little bit about the digital supply chain. You're way more
Yep.
qualified than I am to talk about that one.
Yeah. The digital supply chain is really about the link to the supplier and the customer,
Mm-hmm.
right? How do we become more intelligent and sustainable with digital? Let me say it differently. By adopting digital into our supply chain, how do we become more intelligent and sustainable? How do we become more anticipatory, transparent, and on demand? Right? It's that link that uh, follows the entire supply chain from the supplier through manufacturing to the customer. So I think that's one of the focus areas we can apply digital and really change the game, right? And new ways of supporting that
And
supply
and
chain.
running your plant on a monthly spreadsheet ain't cutting it.
No, it's got to be more real time. It's got to be more visible,
And
right? It's got to be more
and I say that
anticipatory.
a little bit jokingly, but truth be told, American manufacturing is run on spreadsheets. I know we have SAP and we have, Pi and other data historians and our manufacturing execution systems. All that stuff ends up in a spreadsheet. And that's what people look at.
Unfortunately, all too
Yeah.
often,
Way
right?
too often. We see it all the time. And I don't care what industry. So,
Now, I want to, before we shift gears and talk about the other two priority transformation components, let's call it that way. Let's call it that. I want to change the order a little bit
okay.
because I know I've written order in the agenda, Jim. But the next one, I want to tackle this idea of autonomous plant. You brought it up, and I think it gets misrepresented so often. Right? It used to be when you said autonomous plant, you walked into a manufacturing facility and nobody was there. And it's true, right? With our current labor challenges, with people not liking dull, dirty, and dangerous, uh, automation is part of that, right? Physical automation, even process automation is part of
I
that.
think
But it's really
robotics
to
too.
address, yeah, robotics. It's really to address the dull, dirty, dangerous, right? It's not to say, hey, we need to get rid of people, we need to reduce costs. That is not the objective. It's how do we better support people? Cobots, AGVs, right, are all part of this autonomous plan. And yeah, that'll remain some of the focus. But I also want to call out another component that I think is often missed. How about the improved employee performance and experience? How about doing the things that make people's jobs easier? So the people who are there come in and enjoy their work. They're focused on continuous improvement. You can attract a plant supervisor because it's not right? That's also part of this autonomous plant. It's not walking in and all the people are gone. That's misleading,
I think so too.
right? It's about automating where practical, physical, logical automation where practical, and also making people's jobs and lives easier while at work, safer while at
I
work,
think some of the
right?
some of the interesting trends I've seen that make a lot of sense in that regard, right? Is we pretty much everybody's seen these robots from Boston Dynamics, right? If you have those going out and doing inspections, looking at, infrared, looking for hot spots in your
Right.
bus bars or
Very
motors or
good.
things of that nature, right? Things that are, dirty, you know, sometimes can be tough jobs, let those, things do that kind of work. We saw the, drones inspecting, power transmission equipment, right? Instead of somebody climbing up on something or a lift truck or something along those lines, they're actually flying drones up, and it's much quicker. And then you send the human to where something needs to be repaired or something needs to be further inspected. But you can generally tell when things are good. So we're seeing some of that improvement, and making things a little bit safer or potentially a lot safer. and less of that dirty, dull, repetitive, work that sometimes can cause injuries too. So, and I think to your point, it can enhance, what you're doing. It can make the plant run better and faster and more stable and more reliable, but
And I think we'll
you're
go
not,
much deeper.
yeah, and you're not going to
We're going
eliminate
to go
people
much
though.
deeper.
Yeah, to your point, you're not going to
Yeah,
eliminate them.
exactly. It's not all about eliminating people. And we're going to go much
Oh,
deeper
100%,
into that,
100%. But I think those were like
and
some of the examples that we can talk about, as kind of a teaser, some of those kind of things. So,
and then the third one, and again, we talked about digital supply chain, we talked about autonomous plant, and there's something in the middle there. And we've chosen to label it smart manufacturing. Maybe we change that label to something like remote operation services.
mm-hmm.
But this whole idea is how do we start looking at a fleet of assets, right? And managing that fleet of assets better, leveraging best practices, recognizing benchmark performance, baselining on a site-by-site basis. So this whole idea of there is this idea of leverage across multiple like operating lines. So it could be intra-company, inside a company, remote operation support, right, for benchmark performance and continuous improvement. It can be the idea of driving better continuous subject matter expertise and related innovation, right? So we have, instead of having a person dedicated per site, how do we bring in, some number of people that are looking at a dozen sites, 24 sites, and they're monitoring those operations and they're innovating on a site-by-site basis,
You're
right? Now
yeah.
we mitigate risk of attrition in the likes and retirement, right? Or job turnover, job loss, right? We eliminate
That
that.
actually is.
Another side
Hang
of
on,
it is,
I want to hit on that point a little
okay,
bit. I've talked to some customers about that. I have that exact same mindset. I'm glad you said all of that. There's been a couple of companies I've had some discussions with that I said you really ought to consider some kind of remote, or centralized center, because you think about where has manufacturing traditionally been located? Rural America, small towns, right? A lot of these younger people now, they don't mind moving to small town Arkansas, small town Minnesota, small town Ohio for a little while, right? I'll live in El Dorado, Arkansas, or I'm trying to think of a small town in Minnesota, or I'll live in Androscoggin, Maine for a couple years, and learn the ropes and, understand things. But that's not where I'm going to live the next 30 years. I assure you that.
great call.
And
Yeah.
so why would you invest in someone and then you don't make those next positions available to them in places where they actually want to live? You've invested time and money into this person to train them. They've learned your operation. Very likely they're good at what they're doing and you want to keep them. And then you can't find a position for them. And I think those kind of things are to exactly what you said, helps with some of the attrition is, hey, instead of, go to this facility, learn our business, learn the ropes, give them a path to, and then the next step might be, working in a remote operations center, and you have 4 like facilities, and you can either work from home or work in a centralized location at, in a bigger place, where there's a lot to do and a lot of opportunity. And then you still may travel some, to those sites. Most people are like, hey, I don't mind, traveling once or twice a month. I kind of like it in certain regards, getting out and seeing something different. But at least I'm not there grinding away every day, doing that 70-hour job. I'm not getting all those reactive calls. I feel like I can actually use those talents to make things better, as you said, for a couple of places to a dozen, right, that are similar. And I've talked to some companies about that, and they're kind of getting it and they're kind of not. I mean, I actually talked to an engineer just last week that wants to do something like that, and the company's literally requiring them to move to some specific locations, and they have two choices, and they're like, I don't want to live in either one of those places. I can't do it from where I'm at, and the job doesn't require, it's just that they want them to be in one of those two places. Why? I don't really understand that. The reality is none of my people live in the same town I do. Ben, when I hired him, I moved him here so that I could train him in the way I wanted to do things, and I wanted some of that relationship building, and I knew he was probably going to be that guy that I invested in for the future of my company. Right, I knew that very early on.
In some industries, I want to call something out, Jim. Some industries have done a much better job of adopting that mindset than others.
Yeah.
But the opportunity is there for all industries, and I'll say that very confidently because I've worked across industries. Yeah. Right, the opportunity is there. It's what those companies choose.
It is, and
right?
I don't understand some of the choices they make, but that has to change. Continue. Sorry,
I want to call just a few more things because we'll dig deeper into this, I think, in part two. But two more things. The other thing to think about when you think about this remote operation services, it's not only what you do within a company, it's what you do with external service providers. Let me give you a great example. Nearly every manufacturer has utilities. In many cases, those utilities become a secondary focus. Mm-hmm. Would they be better served with an external service to optimize, to maintain your utilities? It's an idea, but I think things that fall outside a company's IP, food manufacturing, metals manufacturing, maybe it would be good to consider external services and not try to do it all in-house. And again, it comes down to what is your priority focus? What is the heart and soul of your company, right? So you may have opportunities to adopt more of a service-oriented mindset.
Thought about that.
Interesting. And then the final one I want to call out with this remote operation services is how do we better train and develop an ever-changing workforce, right? We talked about the idea of people coming in and staying for 30 years. In the future, it's probably not going to happen. We're going to be constantly facing turnover. How do we better train and develop those resources near real time? And that's something that I think sets above the plant level to some extent. And how do we really develop best practice mindset across like manufacturing processes, like technologies? And I think there's tremendous opportunity to do that. Every plant is different, but we do have like processes, like lines. And how do we do a better job of training and developing people consistently?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because we have a facility we've been dealing with for almost 5 years now, on a constant basis. And what's interesting is they've turned over pretty much every area at least twice. New engineers, moving people around, new engineers coming in, engineer leaves, new one coming in. It's kind of funny. We've actually had more continuity than they've had in their own facility with some of the solutions we've built. And so we're actually helping augment some of that training and giving them kind of a head start, and things. I would have never thought that when I started this business. That really wasn't an intent that I had. And then, Ben just went to a facility that we literally have done training 2 times at before since 2018, and they've turned over. And they're kind of in the process of turning over again. And I actually ran into one of their engineers yesterday, and we were kind of talking through that is, they're constantly in and out, constantly moving people in and out, moving around, and she was like, we'd never written up any standard procedures on how to do certain things. So the training, you would do it, but it would kind of get lost. Nobody would ever have okay, here's how you create a PI tag. Here's how you set up an OPC connection. Here's how you set up things in KEP server, and even just little pieces of things that they need to know how to do. There was no procedure. There was nothing written down. Why? Because no one had time to do it.
the worst case scenario there, Jim, and you, again, think about services you get from the outside. Some are very appropriate, right? The worst case scenario is when it's your IP and people from outside your company are providing your IP expertise. So I think about it like the work you're doing as an integrator. When you start knowing a lot about the process of the customers you serve, and they're losing that expertise in-house, that is a big red flag in my mind.
It is
a big
it
red
is to me
flag.
too. I was working for a system integrator, and we had a customer that we had a bunch of their ex-employees. You know, every time they would have a layoff or something like that, we would hire all the good ones. And it got to a point where I'm like, we have more people who know about how to make their product than they do. I wouldn't want that.
That's pretty scary.
It's pretty scary because then you're kind of enslaved to them a little bit. I mean, it was good for the company I was working for, right? As long as they still had some capital money that they could spend, right? I mean, but that was scary to me, and in the case that I was describing, we don't know that much because we're not there every day, but we've built some solutions that help people learn the process quicker. All right, so let's talk a little bit about where we're going in part 2, Lance. We've kind of hit a lot of things, talked about a lot of subjects. What's next on the agenda?
Yeah, so in part 1, again, just recapping, we wanted to talk about the history, the headwinds we face, and really what we're seeing as a result that needs to drive change.
Yep.
We also introduced the idea of industrial and manufacturing transformation and what it could really look like. So in part 2, I think what we'd like to do is introduce that idea of industrial and manufacturing transformation, go a little deeper into the concepts, and talk about the journey to get there, the journey to success. Because this is not a light switch you just flick and you're there, right?
No.
So even when you think about the future and where you want to land, it's a journey to get there. It's a maturity journey, really. So I think what we'll do in part 2 is really focus on, again, reintroducing that vision of the future. What does it look like? And then talking about the journey to success. What's it going to look like along the way?
Yep.
And then, I'll also mention beyond part 2, we'll get into part 3, which will be more technology oriented and focused.
Yep.
So if people are looking for that, that's coming.
Yeah.
But we wanted to start with the perspective from a manufacturing and industry point of view.
100%. We got to set up the why. Like, why is this even important? Why should you pay attention? Right. I think we talked about that. It was like, why, what, how. That's kind of the format and flow is what we were thinking. So today was why, a little bit of the what. This is why we're here. This is why it's important. Because we have all these challenges. So what are we going to do about it next?
Yep, that sounds appropriate to me, and it's a little bit of the Simon Sinek mindset, right? You got to start with why, where, and why.
100%. All right. Well, Lance, thanks for talking to us today, man. It's been really, really good.
More to come, and look forward to jumping on parts 2 and 3, and let's see how this one turns out.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Take care, everyone.
Right, talk soon. Bye-bye.